Good morning, everyone. My name is Jessie Roth, and I'm a librarian at the Pasadena Public Library's Hill Avenue branch. I'm joined by our presenter, Tim Wheeler, as well as several members of the City of Pasadena Water and Power team. We're welcoming you to the Promoting Soil Health and Planting Tips. This is part of our Pasadena Grows Gardening Program series. This is being done in partnership with Pasadena Water and Power. And if you're not already familiar with Pasadena Grows, I'm going to tell you a little about it right now. It's an initiative started out of the Hill Library and managed by the staff, as well as our devoted volunteer, Stephen Smith. And the aim is to encourage local residents to build gardens and gain knowledge to make them even better. It includes a seed library, which is currently closed, but it will be available again once the library buildings have reopened. And with the seed library, you can check out seeds to plant in your own gardens as well. And we have both like plants as well as a lot of fruits and vegetables. And we also offer a program series with various guest presenters. And since we are a library, we do have an extensive gardening book collection that is free to borrow with your Pasadena Public Library card. Even though our Hill location is not offering curbside pickup, it is available at 8 different locations. So you can request these books online through the online catalog and have them sent to any of the participating locations. And in case you're wondering, library buildings are not yet open, but please check on our website for the latest updates about reopening. With the closure, our programs have gone virtual. Our next one will be November 14th. It's called Fall and Winter Gardening, and it's with Yvonne Savio, she's a master gardener, has done several programs with us. Please keep an eye on the online calendar for when registration opens for that program, and you can also keep in the know by being on our Pasadena Grows email list. If you're interested in joining, please contact me. My email's on the screen here, and I'd be happy to add you to that list. And we have a few Zoom-related things before we get started. This program is being recorded. We hope to make the program available for viewing on both the Pasadena Public Library YouTube channel as well as the Water and Power's website. It's not going to be an immediate posting thing. We have to get the recording edited and cleaned up, but it should be up in a matter of weeks. Also, all mics have been muted except for our presenters. So if you have any questions for Tim Wheeler or the Water and Power staff, please put them in the chat. We will keep an eye out for these questions and make sure that they get answered in the Q&A at the end of the presentation. I'll now be handing things over to Priscilla Echeverry from Water and Power, who will let us know more about the many programs and services available through them.
Okay, good morning, everyone. We are so happy to see you here on a Saturday morning to attend our virtual workshop. So today, our workshop will cover building healthy soil and planting tips and care. So today I'm joined by Ursula Schmidt, Christian Cox, and Lucio Gonzalez with the PWP team. So we are here to answer any questions that you may have. We are fielding questions through the chat box, but we will also be addressing them at the end in person. So let's go ahead and get started. So before we go into the workshop and Tim Wheeler instructing the workshop, I want to go over a few PWP programs that we offer and events and workshops. So this first slide here covers our events and workshops. So we are very active in the community. We do hold plenty of events and workshops. Right now we are holding them virtually due to the pandemic. So if you are interested in any other workshops or anything that we have going on, we have the link here on this slide. I also want to talk about a program that we offer that is landscape related. So because you're attending this workshop, we are thinking that you are considering doing some kind of landscape transformation. So we think this is an excellent time to take a look at our $2 per square foot turf rebate. So we do offer this. We have all of our guidelines and criteria on our website, and the link is listed here. But just to go over a few so you are a little bit familiar with it, you do get a $2 per square foot rebate, which is pretty substantial. We have a minimum of 200 square feet of turf to be removed. It does have to be drought tolerant landscape. You can remove up to 5,000 square feet. You must have 3 plants per 100 square feet planted. And you must convert your spray heads to more efficient irrigation, such as drip, microspray, or bubblers. Synthetic turf is also not included in this program. If you have any more specific questions about the program, go ahead and submit your question in the chat box, and then we can address them. We also have a spray to drip program, and this is really good. That goes alongside with our turf rebate because you are required to convert your spray irrigation to more efficient irrigation. And this is a great program. It's very streamlined. It's very easy for the community to do. All you have to do is submit your application, and you submit it to water@cityofpasadena.net. You can go onto our website to download the application, and then you can receive your kit. So it's really streamlined, really easy, and it can convert up to 400 square feet of spray irrigation to drip irrigation. And now, without further ado, I will be handing this presentation over to our instructor, Tim Wheeler, who is a horticulturist, and we like to call him our landscape professional for Pasadena. So take it away, Tim.
All right, thank you. Good morning, everybody. The reason Pasadena Water and Power, is interested in you guys building healthier soils, putting in more drought tolerant plant material, etc., is it's all about water efficiency. And having landscape, every house or structure should have some kind of landscape because it becomes part of the urban habitat. But we also have to be very concerned about water. So really what these classes are going to be is they're kind of multiple benefit in that you're going to have healthier landscapes, but you're also going to need less water because healthy plants don't require as much water as plants that are under stress. So with that, what's the connection with the soil? Well, healthy soil is critical in both plant health and efficient water use. And so as we talk through the class and you look at making improvements to your soil, you are not only going to be creating better growing conditions, but you're also going to be creating better water storage conditions in your soil. So when you do apply water, it goes into the soil and is there for the plants. Or when we get rain, hopefully we can reduce the water that's runoff, that's lost off your property. We can keep more of it there for plant development. Healthy soil is going to increase root development, and healthy roots are critical for drought tolerance. And we really want to create a good habitat for beneficial organisms. If you look at the picture on the slide there, you'll notice the plant on the right has those yellow strings kind of attached to the root system. And those are actually fungus, mycorrhizae fungus. And it's a symbiotic relationship. Both organisms are benefiting from growing together. The mycorrhizae fungus help to provide nutrients and water to the plant because they're attached to the plant's root system, and they can absorb water and nutrients and then transfer those into the plant. And so if you consider that entire fungus mass as an extension of the root system, you see how much bigger it is than the plant on the left. The fungus benefit from this because the plant provides them with nutrients and sugars for their survival. So we want to create soils where not only the plants are developing good root systems, but we're also providing excellent habitat for beneficial fungus, beneficial bacteria, and beneficial organisms. Okay, next slide. By the way, you're going to hear me refer to next slide at the end of each slide because Priscilla's actually doing that for me. So don't let it throw you. So what is a healthy soil? Well, it supports biological function, it promotes healthy plants, and it is just overall beneficial to the environment because of the habitat it provides, because of it allows water to infiltrate as opposed to having runoff, things like that. Next slide. What are the characteristics? What are we aiming for in having a healthy soil? Well, minimal compaction. Compaction is one of the biggest problems that we have in the urban environment. And Generally, compaction restricts root development on your plants, but it also contributes greatly to water runoff, water loss, water inefficiency. So that's one of the things we really try to address when we're looking at improving our soil. We want good soil fertility, and that can be addressed a couple of ways, through organic materials or through things like fertilizers. You want to optimize the water that's being put down. In other words, when you apply water to the landscape, you want to make sure it's going to be used in a beneficial manner. Generally, that means putting the water on slowly, for instance, kind of like a drip irrigation system. You don't want to be putting on huge amounts of water under high pressure that's going to cause erosion or just run off into the street. You want good water storage, and I'll talk about that in the next couple slides. Where does the water get stored in the soil? And you want to have a good supply of water in the soil, and for the soil to be able to hold water until the plants require it. And then lastly, we want good soil biology. Like I touched on, we want all of our beneficial friends in the soil to have a good environment to grow and survive in. Next slide. So the ideal soil. Basically, this is usually only achieved in a laboratory. It's a moving target. But the concept behind it is, if you look at that, an ideal soil is about half mineral and organic matter and about half air and water. And what throws a lot of people is the fact that you really want as much air in the soil as you do water. You want those in balance. Air in the soil is absolutely critical to good, healthy roots and root development. So usually if we're overwatering, we're actually harming. Not only are we wasting water, but we tend to drive the air out of the soil, and that can lead to problems in the root system. That 5% organic matter, I like to see that number a little bit higher myself. You can't go wrong with having more organic matter in the soil, but you do need some, and that's the point of that. Is you don't want just air, water, and minerals. You definitely want some organic matter in there also. Okay, next slide. So a little bit about soil classifications, because you'll hear this referred to a lot of times when you buy your plants. The little tag that comes with it will tell you, what kind of soil the plant likes. And it's not the chemical makeup of the soil, because that's pretty consistent. Throughout the whole city of Pasadena, the soil is basically what's washed down from the San Gabriel Mountains. So chemically, it's pretty much the same throughout the whole city. What differs is the size of the soil particles. And when we talk about a clay soil or a sandy soil, what we're really talking about is not the chemical makeup of the soil, but the size of the particles. So in giving you an example, how a clay soil differs from like a sandy soil, we'll say a fine sand. If you had a particle of clay soil and you had it in your hand and it was about the size of a BB, and then you had a particle of fine sand in the other hand, that would be about the size of a basketball. So the relationship between clay and sand is really a size difference, and it's a substantial size difference. Next slide. So why does that matter? Well, if you look at my two drums there, one of them's got basketballs in it, so sand particles, and the other's got clay in it, so BB-sized particles. And if you notice that the one with the clay in it, right in the center, there's one little black dot. That represents one single particle of clay versus those basketballs. And what's important about this slide is not the size of the particles, but the space in between the particles, because that's where your air and water storage is. So sandy soils tend to have great big spaces between the particles, lots of air. The problem with sandy soils is that water moves down through those big spaces quite easily. If you have a clay soil, you can't even hardly see the spaces between the individual particles. And that creates a challenge for us. It creates a challenge in that when we try to put water onto all those BBs, the particles and the space between the particles is so small that we have to put the water on very, very slowly. And then we have to wait as long as we possibly can before we water again, because as that water moves into the soil, we want the air to also move into the soil. It takes much longer in clay soils than in sandy soils. Next slide. Oh, by the way, just on that, can you back up one slide? That third drawing there is just an example of pore space. This, you've got all the different particles of soil there, and then you've got the space in between them, and that's where your air and water is stored. Okay. So, soil type is important because plants can be pretty picky about the kind of soil they want to grow in. And usually if you're looking at horticulture materials, gardening books, or you're going to the nursery and you look at the slide or the tag that comes with the plants, you will notice it might say, requires a well-drained soil. Well-drained is sandy. And the opposite of a well-drained soil would be a clay soil, which doesn't drain so well. That's one of our challenges with California natives is usually they do better in well-drained soils. It doesn't mean you cannot grow them in clay. You just have to be much more careful about your water management to make sure that you get that air into the soil for their root systems. Typically with California natives, they do not like what we say wet feet. They don't want a root system that stays damp. So just basically through observation of working throughout the city of Pasadena, it seems that most people have what we'd call a clay loam. So that's a mix between very small particles and medium-sized particles. Pretty good soil. I haven't noticed a lot of real challenging soil that, where I would tell people you just absolutely can't grow plants that are sensitive to being a little on the moist side. We've actually had pretty good success even with the natives by managing the water really well. If you're not sure what you have, a couple of simple observations. Do you have runoff really easy? If you get runoff, meaning you turn your sprinklers on or you get a little bit of rain and it seems like most of that water runs off the property and into the gutter, good chance you have a lot of clay in your soil and or you have a lot of compaction. If when you're out working in the yard, the soil always seems wet, no matter how long it's been since the last watering or the last rain, you get down a little ways in the soil real wet, chances are it's clay. Your plants don't perform as well in a clay soil, especially a compacted clay soil. It almost works like a clay pot and it will restrict root development and you'll actually get smaller plants. And then a worst case scenario is you're out working in the yard and the soil really smells. It stinks like rotten eggs. That's a very good indicator that you have some kind of problem. And what's happening there is that you have a lot of water in the soil and not much oxygen. And because you don't have much oxygen, the soil has gone what we call anaerobic, which means it's loaded with bacteria that don't like air, that does not like oxygen. And they are making that smell. They create that smell. So that's a definite indicator that you need to look at trying to loosen your soil up, aerate it, and uncompact it. Next slide. The picture in that slide there is, that's where a lot of our urban compaction comes from. Is actually construction. Before they build structures, they'll go in and they want to make sure they have a very nice, tightly compacted soil. Great for buildings, lousy for landscapes. So oftentimes, if you have lots and lots of compaction, it's because it was done purposely. And that's one of the things that, especially with brand new landscapes and new construction, you really have to spend some time addressing that if you're going to have long-term success. Generally in Pasadena, most of the construction is old enough that it's not serious compaction from construction. I haven't seen huge problems with lots of compaction throughout, but I have seen a lot of surface type compaction, you know, the top 6 inches and stuff. And that just comes from general purpose use. Walking through the landscape when it's wet, things like that will lead to compaction. One of the best ways to solve compaction is the addition of organic material. It just continually adding organics to your soil helps to relieve the compaction. Gypsum will also do that, but it takes a while. At the end of this class, I'll give you a little recipe for soil. If you're wanting to improve your soil that you have, or maybe create a new soil for pots or for above ground gardening. And you'll notice that there's gypsum in there and there's lots of organics. And those are to help address compaction. Next slide. Okay, so soil fertility. Really quick primer on plant nutrition. Nitrogen, phosphorus, and potassium are kind of the big 3 elements that plants require to be, you know, for healthy growth. Nitrogen helps the plant with photosynthesis. When you put down fertilizer, you're really not feeding the plant. The only thing plants eat are sunlight through the process of photosynthesis. What you're doing when you put down those nitrogen is you are helping that plant to create things like amino acids and things that it needs in order to be able to better utilize sunlight. Phosphorus is really important in root development and shoot development and in the production of flowers and fruit. And then potassium, we don't worry about so much here in Southern California because our soils are naturally very high in potassium. It doesn't hurt if you have a fertilizer with potassium in it. You cannot over apply it, but typically we don't worry so much about that. It's nitrogen and phosphorus are the 2 that we really try to concentrate on. Ideally, you have a balanced nutrition in your soil where the plants are removing elements that they need to grow and to create fruit, etc. And so ideally, you're trying to replace that as the plants use it. Again, without a bunch of soil tests and things like that, you're not going to actually know that. It just kind of comes with a feel. The one thing about adding lots of organics to your soil is that you are naturally putting those elements back into the soil as the plant removes them. So you will find that if you have a good, you know, mulching program, you're not going to need chemical fertilizers to the degree that you do if you don't do any mulching. And it depends on the plants. You know, if you're growing natives, they have a very low nutrition requirement. So it's pretty easy to have those in your landscape without any real fertilizer, as long as you're using, you know, some organic matter for mulch. If you're growing fruits and vegetables, well, those plants have a very high removal rate, especially phosphorus. So you may have to end up adding that on an annual basis. Things that you can do just to put organics back in are using compost and mulch. Grass cycling, if you know, on your turf, just leaving the clippings behind. That comment in there, nutrient cycling, that's what Mother Nature does. That's how Mother Nature balances nutrients in the soil, is that as plants grow and they shed their leaves, they shed their fruit, branches break off, typically that falls into the root zone of the plant. Over time, it decomposes back into the soil, and those nutrients then become available for the plants again. So the plant, it's a circle. The plant is growing, it drops its debris, the debris goes into the soil, decomposes, and then the plant can utilize that as nutrients to grow. In the urban environment, we have come to the point where we are keeping our landscapes way too clean. You know, the backpack blower is basically the enemy of organic material. And so all of the debris that your plants are dropping that would naturally become, you know, nutrients for that plant eventually are being removed, you know, on a weekly basis. So we find a lot of nutrition deficiencies in urban environments because we're keeping our landscape way too clean. Um, we should be leaving more of that material behind so it can decompose and the plant can use the nutrients. Next slide. So a little bit about reading a fertilizer label. In order for something to legally be called a fertilizer, the three numbers on the bag, you're going to find a number for nitrogen, a number for phosphorus, and a number for potassium. Those three numbers have to add up to 5. So you'll see a lot of, you know, steer manure is kind of the classic. It's like a 200. So they call it an amendment, not a fertilizer. When you look at the label and you see those numbers, that's the minimum analysis. It can have more of the material in there, but it can't have any less. The nitrogen, phosphorus, and potassium, those numbers are always going to be in the same order. Nitrogen is always going to be first, phosphorus is always going to be second, potassium is always going to be third. And when you see those numbers, they're talking about a percentage. Next slide. So we're going to get back to fertilizers here in a minute, but what we're really looking to do is balance. You know, you can over fertilize, and too much fertilizer in the landscape can harm the beneficial organisms in the soil. So what we really want to do, and we're considering plant nutrition and fertilizers, is we need to keep in mind the beneficial organisms. Because those organisms, like I showed you in that first slide, you know, the mycorrhizae fungus that grow in the root zone, they're helping that plant to absorb water, to absorb nutrients. So they're a huge benefit. There are organisms that have to convert nutrients into a form that the plant can actually use. Not too different from the human body. You know, if you eat a steak and a baked potato for supper, that has to go through your digestive system and be broken down for your body to truly be able to use the materials. And the same thing happens with plants. The organic materials have to be, even the fertilizers have to be broken down into a form that the plant can actually use. A big element in that nutrient cycling are not only the fungus and the bacteria, but the other organisms that are very good in our soil. You know, we want lots of earthworms. We want pill bugs. Earwigs, you know, they're all those are all organisms that help break material down so that the plant can use it. So if you see those in your landscape, that's a good sign. It means that your soil is healthy and supporting those organisms. You just have to be a little bit careful that you don't create a situation where you have too much of a good thing. You know, too many pill bugs, too many earwigs, that kind of thing. You have to be kind of careful about the chemicals you use in your landscape because, again, they can affect the soil biology. The good news is that most of the chemicals we use in the landscape are designed to be broken down either by the organisms in the landscape and or sunlight. So as long as we're applying those chemicals according to the label at proper amounts, typically we don't have a lot of problems, you know, with contaminated soil, that kind of thing. It's when the chemicals are abused that we see most of our issues. And the beneficial organisms in the soil also help to suppress the pathogens and the things in the soil that can cause us problems with our plants. So again, it's about having that balance. If we can help keep a natural balance in our soil, you're going to have a healthier biology in your whole landscape all the way across. Next slide. So, reading a bag of fertilizer. We have a palm fertilizer, a hibiscus fertilizer, and a rose fertilizer. So you're thinking, well, if I have palms, I need the palm fertilizer, and if I have a hibiscus, I need that fertilizer, and obviously we need rose food for our roses. But look at the numbers. The hibiscus fertilizer and the rose number, identical, 1268. So unless you have plants that can actually read, they're not going to know whether you're using a rose fertilizer on a hibiscus or a hibiscus fertilizer on a rose. And quite frankly, the palm fertilizer is within 1%. You know, it's a 13% nitrogen versus a 12% nitrogen in the other two. Little bit lower potassium, but still within 1%. Oh, actually, the phosphorus, excuse me, a little bit lower phosphorus, and the potassium is identical. So the moral of the story is, when you go to buy fertilizer, don't look at the label, look at the numbers. Because oftentimes you're going to find that you can find one fertilizer that will work on all of your plants just fine. Okay, next slide. So what are the benefits? If we go through the process of working on building up organic materials and things in our soils? Food, habitat, the ability to hold water. Remember, part of this process is going to naturally relieve compaction, and as you relieve compaction and you get better pore space, you get better water storage, you get better oxygen storage. And you start to get a natural balance of nutrients from the organic material breaking down. And you will find that you need less, stuff out of a bag, less fertilizer that you have to purchase. There will still be times when you may want to address certain deficiencies. An iron deficiency, typically you have to put on a material designed for that. Even at certain times of the year, you might want a little bit more nitrogen than you're getting from your organic. So I'm not going to say that you won't need fertilizer ever again. What I will say is that the more organic material you have in your soil, the less fertilizer you're going to require. If you look at the very bottom there, that nitrogen cycle, remember I was saying that the nutrients have to be in a form the plant can use? Well, the only thing a plant can use is nitrogen. And so when we put down fertilizers, typically it has to be converted into that nitrogen, and the soil organisms do that. There's bacteria in the soil that will actually break down whatever type of fertilizer you're putting on, or if you're putting organic materials on. It breaks it first into ammonia, and then from ammonia it becomes a nitrate, and then it continues to break it down, turn it into a nitrite, and then a nitrate. The only form of nitrogen that a plant can use is nitrate. So no matter what you're putting on as the source of nitrogen, it's going to have to be converted. The bacteria that do that do not work well in cold weather. When the soil temperatures drop, they go to sleep. They go dormant, basically. So it doesn't make sense to fertilize in the wintertime because the bacteria that you need to convert your fertilizers to the form the plant can use, they're going to be asleep. And so that material is just going to sit in the soil until springtime when the soil temperatures come back up. So ideally, the best time to fertilize is going to be in the spring after the soil temperatures have warmed up. And again, right about now. Put on a little bit of fertilizer to get you through the winter, but you need to put it on now before the soil temperatures get cold. Okay, next slide. So what kind of organics should we be putting on? Well, one of the best organics to put on is just leaving the material that falls off the plant. Now, sometimes that can be too much of a good thing. For instance, we're headed into fall now, and your deciduous trees are going to drop, lots and lots of leaves, and you probably don't need to leave all of those behind. Usually with our mulches that we put on, our organic materials we put on, we like to have about a 4-inch to 6-inch depth. So if you got more than that, then you can certainly take, some of that away. Just make sure you leave enough behind. Wood shavings are very popular. If you're going to buy an organic soil amendment, typically it will be wood shavings. We don't want sawdust because it's too fine. We want nice coarse material. And I give you a little bit of a formula there. Some people are worried about putting organic material on because they're afraid it's going to tie up the nitrogen and the plant won't be able to use it. And that can happen. It's fairly rare, but it can happen. And typically it only happens when you first start putting the organic material on. So if you've never used any mulch and you decide that, hey, I think mulch might be a good idea in my yard, and this fall you decide to put some on, you might put on a little bit of nitrogen when you do that, just to help compensate for the fact that the bacteria are going to be working on this mulch, and they're not going to be providing nutrients to the plant. You compensate for it, but it's the first time only. Once you get that nitrogen cycle and the organic material working in your yard on a yearly basis, you won't see any nitrogen deficiency. Actually, you should see improvements as that material breaks down. You can buy, as opposed to wood shavings, you can buy material made of bark, redwood, fir, cedar. They're more expensive, but they break down more slowly, so you don't have to apply them as often. They're more of a high-end material, and a lot of times we do it for aesthetics, because they tend to be a nicer looking material when we put them down as opposed to, say, tree trimmings, that kind of thing. Next slide. So a few more. Peat moss, that's a real high-end soil additive, and we typically only use that on really expensive plants, azaleas and camellias that we're putting in, potted plants, things like that. Steer manure, be really careful with it. There really aren't a whole lot of benefits to steer manure in the fact that, one, it's ground very fine. And when you're amending soil or mulching, you really want nice coarse material. The finer it's ground up, the faster it's going to decompose, which means more of it you have to put on. And steer manure has only got about 1% nitrogen in it. So it's very low in nitrogen as far as providing nutrients to the plant. And it tends to have lots of weed seed in it and lots of salt, both which do not benefit your landscape at all. Now, a lot of bags of steer manure, you say, it'll say it's been composted and, weed free and all these. Don't believe it. Weed seed can be very, very hard to get rid of, very tough. So it's not that I'm against manures, horse manure, chicken manure, rabbit manure, all really good stuff. Just go easy on the steer manure. Activated sludge. It's a byproduct of sewage processing. It's good and it's bad. And it's great for ornamental plants. High in nitrogen, full of good bacteria to help with the decomposing process of organic materials. So it's got a lot of benefits. but you can't use it on vegetables or edibles. So your fruits and vegetables, you do not want to use any kind of products that have activated sludge in them. Because it also tends to be high in heavy metals. Our bodies are very good at getting rid of heavy metals, and they end up in the waste. And you do not want to be putting those back onto your edibles. So activated sludge is great for ornamentals, but not vegetable. Next slide. What you're seeing there is actually two really good processes going on. It's one process with two huge benefits. This was a project that is ongoing. We completed the planting of it earlier this year. And what you're seeing there is a process called sheet mulching. And the primary reason for doing it is organic weed control. And it consists of putting down a thick layer of cardboard and then covering it with a thick layer of wood chips. And the idea behind it is to block out the sunlight and so that the weeds don't germinate. And any weeds that are there, you block out the sunlight, and basically they starve to death because they can't get any sunlight. The extra side benefit to this process is all of the nutrients that are being put back into the soil. Because the cardboard decomposes into nothing, and the material that they're putting over the top, the wood chips, also break down. And we have been amazed. They did a very thorough job of applying this thick, heavy cardboard, probably a minimum of 6 inches of organic material. And it's been really something to see how fast it has decomposed and gone back into the soil to the point where that site is getting ready to need to be have another application of wood chips applied to it. And that's a really good sign. That means that there's healthy biology. You've got a lot of decomposers in your soil, and all of that material that's been put on is going to go back into the soil and benefit the plants on the site. Next slide. So here's just a couple recipes of if you want to create a garden from scratch, you know, how to go about amending your soils. It makes for an excellent, you know, soil for vegetable gardens, for instance. So if you want to do a raised bed garden or do gardening in pots, any kind of landscape would benefit from this, but typically that's what we would use it for. And it's, you know, organic material, soil, some gypsum, a little bit of fertilizer, and you're good to go. The fertilizer would probably need to be reapplied, but everything else is a one-time application. Next slide. Here's another kind of a man-made soil. If you're maybe in an apartment or a condo and you don't have an access to any landscape soil, you can buy materials and create the soil. So organic material, soil, you know, buy bags of topsoil and the fertilizers. So this is one that even if you don't have access to real soil in your landscape, you could still create a really good soil for growing in. And it's, like I said, I think I would use this more for, say, condos and apartments and things like that. Next slide. Okay, so we transitioned out of soils. Again, if you have any questions for me, you know, make sure you're putting them in the chat box, and we will have a question section at the end of this next part that we're going to go through. So I'll get to answer any questions that you have on soils, as well as planting techniques at the end. Next slide. So the planting techniques we're going to discuss are basically those for urban landscapes. You know, we're not going to talk about farming or that, you know, anything on that scale. We're going to talk about what are the planting techniques for an urban landscape. And they're basically different techniques depending on what kind of planting you're going to do. If you're going to be putting down seed, and we call that direct planting, because the seed's going to go right into the soil and the plant is going to grow right in that location. Or indirect planting, which is transplanting. So you go to the store and you buy plants, whether they're in little 2-inch by 2-inch liners or 1-gallon pots or 5-gallon pots or 24-inch boxes. Those are all considered indirect planting. And basically it's transplanting. You're taking the plant out of a container and putting it into the ground. Before you do any planting, you should probably take a quick look at the location where you want to be growing these new plants. Does it have adequate sunlight, or maybe too much sunlight? You know, when you buy your plant on the tag, it usually will tell you this plant requires, you know, full sun, or it needs half sun, which means it needs some shade. So, are you putting the plants in the right location? Do you need to do any prep beforehand? You know, if you've got a big weed patch and you want to, you know, landscape it, one of the things you're going to have to deal with first are all those weeds, and you have to make a determination as to how you're going to do it. We have found the sheet mulching to be an excellent method, an organic method of getting rid of weeds, but it takes a long time. You know, it's you know, basically, if you wanted to plant next spring, you should be doing your sheet mulching right now, so that you know, you got as long a time as possible to make sure you get good control over those weeds, and you're not going to have you know, as many seeds in the soil to germinate, and any weeds that are there now will have enough time to use up all their carbohydrates that they basically die of starvation. Next slide. So seeding, we typically use this for vegetables, for annuals, for herbs, for grass. The advantages of it is it's inexpensive, and you can get a very wide selection of plant material to choose from. It's typically the best method for plants that do not transplant well. There are plants out there that, you know, when you dig them up and you disturb their root zone, they really resent it, and they have very high mortality. For plants that are hard to grow like that, growing from seed is often the best way. The disadvantage is growing from seed is a pretty high potential for failure. So oftentimes you're going to see them having you put in 3 seeds for every plant that you hope grows. So there is a fairly high failure rate with it. It takes longer for the plants to mature. You have to germinate that seed to create the plant from scratch. Whereas if you go and buy a 1-gallon plant, they've already done that for you. All that work's done. So there's a longer window between the time you put the seed in the ground and you get your harvest or your flowers or whatever you happen to be growing. And it's typically maybe a little more labor intensive because instead of just digging the hole, you're preparing an entire area. Usually we'll see seeding in flower beds and gardens. You know, those are the 2 areas that usually are the best candidates for seeding. Next slide. So you have to prepare the area. Well, you don't have to prepare the area, but if you take the time to prepare the area, you're going to get a much, much, much higher survival rate than if you don't. It just makes a huge difference in the success rate that you're going to have. How you prepare the seed bed really depends on the plants that you're growing. But the process is pretty much the same. And, you know, generally you want to get rid of any debris, any weeds, any rocks, anything like that. I put some pictures up of some different seeds that you can make and or buy. And they're great for removing debris in the soil. Typically you want to go down at least 4 inches. You really can't go too deep with this. It just kind of depends on how much time and how much energy you have as to, if you want to go down 1 foot in preparing your seed bed, that's great, you can do it. But usually, no matter what you're growing, you need to go down at least 4 inches. Add in your organic materials. Remember, if it's edible, we do not want to use anything with sewage sludge in it. And then you need to actually contour it. Do you want a flat seed bed, or do you want a furrowed seed bed? And I'm going to show pictures of that here in just a minute. The one thing you want to make sure that you do is that you contour it so that you don't create a water runoff issue. You want to have a border around it, something to capture the water so that when you do put water into this area, it doesn't run off, doesn't run out. Next slide. So do you want a flat seed bed? Do you want a furrow seed bed? Do you want raised mounds? This is kind of controversial amongst gardeners. And to me, it really depends on what you're growing, what kind of plants you're growing, what kind of soil type you have, how you're going to irrigate this. And we're going to talk about irrigation in a minute, but how are you going to water this area? Because if the only way you can water is to put water down at a fairly high rate, then you're going to want some method for capturing that water. Are you growing flowers? Are you growing vegetables? Are you growing shrubs? You know, what are you going to be growing in this area? Because that will also have an effect on what type of seed bed you want to create. What are the plant water needs? You know, are you growing plants that like a dry soil? Or are you growing plants that need a higher moisture level? So you kind of have to make that choice, and the best way to do that is to kind of research the plants that you're growing. Find out a little bit about how they grow, and that will help you determine as to which type of seed bed is going to be right for you. The most important thing in our eyes is making sure you have some kind of border to contain the water so you don't get runoff when you do water your garden area. Next slide. Raised bed gardening, container gardening, the older I get, the more this makes sense. Basically, it involves creating a structure on top of the soil where you can grow. It gives you some options. If you do a raised bed garden or container garden, you can buy a commercial soil mix already prepared and just fill it with that, so you don't have to go through the process of creating your own soil. Things that you should probably consider, that I consider myself, is, you know, how's your back? What kind of condition are you in? Because it's much, much easier to plant, cultivate, harvest in raised beds than it is down on the ground in a flatbed. A flatbed garden, there's a lot of bending and stooping. So that's something you just kind of have to answer for yourself is, you know, what kind of condition you're in. Are you in good enough condition to be, you know, bent over and working in your garden? The things I like about the raised bed gardens is they're easier to plant, they're easier to maintain, they're easier to harvest. I like the option of being able to put a prepared soil mix into them that's already relatively weed-free, that's had the rocks removed from it, that has the organic matter already in it. So it's really a matter of convenience. It's not necessarily a better garden. For a lot of people, it's a more convenient garden. The one benefit in having having it above ground is a lot of vegetables that will tend to rot if they stay on the ground too long. You can keep them above ground easier with a raised bed garden or growing in a container than down on the ground. So that from a horticulture, you know, plant health point of view, that's one advantage to this. Next slide. So how to plant, when to plant, well, that varies plant to plant. And so the best thing I could tell you is look at the seeds, the package. It will tell you the best time to plant, and generally it's based on soil temperature, but it'll tell you when the best time to plant is in your area. It will tell you how deep to put the seeds, and that's critical, absolutely critical in getting good germination. If you plant too deep, oftentimes the plants won't emerge because they don't have enough energy. If it's supposed to go in at a half an inch and you put it in at an inch and a half, the seed might germinate, but the plant will die before it ever pokes itself out of the soil. So putting the plants in at the correct depth is really important. If you look at my seed packet there, it says seed spacing. It says a group of seeds of 3 seeds every 8 inches. And what they're basically telling you is that, you know, you can expect only 1 or 2 of those seeds to actually germinate and create a plant. And the next category is thinning. They have you purposely overplant, and then you have to go back and take out plants. Otherwise, they'll be overcrowded, be too many plants in an area, and most likely they won't get enough sunlight to develop properly. So with seeding, it's really inexpensive, but there's a fair amount of waste because you have to go back and thin out plants. So read the bag, read the seed packet, follow the instructions as far as planting depth, their recommendations on moisture, you know, how wet to keep them, when to thin, that kind of thing, because it makes a big difference. Next slide. So after planting care, this is really critical. I mean, you go through the work of creating a great seed bed, putting the plants in properly, they germinate, and then you have to care for them afterwards. And this is really critical to their survival. We talked about seed depth. It's important because they need a certain amount of darkness for a certain period of time in order to germinate. They need adequate light once they emerge because that becomes their food source. So, and that's the problem with planting too deep, is that they won't get to the light in time. But you also have to be very careful about too much of a good thing, too much light, too much heat. If nothing else, it's going to drive your water use up above what it should be in trying to keep the plants somewhat cool until they can tolerate it. So it's really important that you match the plant requirements to the right location in your yard. Next slide. Okay, speaking of moisture and how you're going to water this, with seeds, it's really important that you put the water on very gently. Whether you're using a handheld sprayer or whether you're using soaker hose or drip or whatever you do, you have to make sure that you put the water on in a proper manner, because you can wash the seed away or wash the covering off the seed before it germinates. So the initial watering method is really important. Generally, the seeds have to be kept moist in order to soften the seed coat enough so that the plant on the inside can swell and break out of that coat and then, you know, start growing up to the surface. And remember, once that plant does come out of that seed, it'll start putting on a very small root, which is going to need to be able to tap into the moisture. So you have to be really careful with your moisture. You want your seed level, your soil to stay relatively, you know, consistently moist, not too wet, because you don't want stuff to rot, and it will if you overwater it. You need consistent moisture, though. Okay, next slide. On that last slide, can we go back? I should talk about the water system that you decide to use really depends on the kinds of plants you're growing. If you're growing annual vegetables, you can have a pretty simple watering system. I love soaker hose for annual gardening, vegetable gardens, even annual flower beds. They're inexpensive. They do need to be replaced every few years, but it's a very inexpensive, simple way to water. Typically, if you're going to use soaker hose or something like that, you're probably going to have to hand water to get the seed germinated. So keep that in mind. Now, you can use a traditional drip system. Let's say that you're not growing annual vegetables. You're growing perennials of some kind. A traditional drip system works beautifully for that, and it's a system that will last for years. So once your plants come up, they're going to be there for however long, whatever the lifespan of that plant is. But the drip makes a lot of sense. The one thing about the traditional drip system is that, and the reason I don't like it in a garden setting where you're just doing annuals, is if you're going to do any kind of cultivation at all, you have to be really careful around it because they're very susceptible to damage. The other thing with a drip system is plant spacing. Depending on the type of drip tubing that you use, you may not have a choice on how close you put your plants together. Typically, if you're buying a drip product that has the emitters already installed on it, the minimum is going to be 12 inches. So you just have to make sure that works for you. Okay, next slide. So indirect planting, these are plants out of containers. It could be out of a flat. When you go to the nursery and you see ground covers and they're in a 16 by 16 by typically 2-inch deep container, we call that a flat. That's one way of doing it. Or you can buy, plugs, which are typically a 2-inch by 2-inch container, all the way up to, a huge tree in a box. Bare root, in January, typically you'll see a lot of bare root fruit trees and roses become available. Another indirect planting method. Typically, it's almost always going to be a perennial. It's almost always going to be a plant that's going to live at least 2 years. Because they're more expensive, oftentimes we use plants, we want our plants to live much longer than that. So with indirect planting, it's not so much about preparing a seed bed. It's going to be about, individual holes for anything other than the plant material coming out of the flat. Oftentimes, if we're going to be putting in ground covers, we'll go ahead and use the seed bed method, just because it allows for much quicker rooting, having that nice soft soil. So if you're putting the ground covers basically in it, they come out of a flat, you probably want to consider using the seed bed preparation method, but everything else in a container is just going to probably go into an individual hole. Common mistakes: planting the plants too deep. That's probably the most common mistake, in that it becomes a problem as the plant matures. Planting a dry plant. In other words, it's critical that your plants are watered before you take them out of the container, typically the night before. Ideally, what we do is we get our plants the day before, we water them the night before they're going to go in the ground, and then once we plant them, we water them again. If you're going to plant the same day, as long as the nursery that you got them from or the store that you got them from watered them before you pick them up, you're going to be fine. But do not plant dry plants. It's really critical to their establishment and their survival that they get watering before they go in the ground. And then the last one is breaking the root ball. And this is really controversial. I have seen people just completely tear root balls apart and put the plants in the ground. In general, that causes a tremendous amount of stress on the plant. And depending on the plant, it can actually be fatal. So I'm not a big fan of, just basically destroying the root ball. What they'll do is they take the roots and they pull them all out and then they spread them out in the hole. And it's not necessary. That plant knows perfectly well how to develop roots once the soil is put back around it. The only thing you want to look for, or not the only thing, but what you want to look for when you buy a plant, if you can take it out of the container, you want to see nice white roots, not not dark brown, certainly not black. That indicates problems. So you want to see nice white roots. You'd like to see roots out to the edge of the root ball, but you don't want to see roots that circle. The circling roots means the plant has been in the container for too long, and what's happened is the roots have grown out to the edge of the container, and now they're starting. The only way they can grow is in a circle. That's not a good thing. So you want to avoid that. So look for a nice white healthy root ball without roots that circle, and you'll be in good shape. Okay, next slide. Again, I mentioned using the seed bed. Oftentimes, if we're going to be putting in what we call plugs, which is what we would do if we're buying plants in a ground cover, put them in on a triangle pattern. It fills in nicer, and you don't end up with like straight lines where you can see the plants are all in a row as they mature. Next slide. Okay. Why is this slide called the $100 hole? Well, in the landscape industry, we have a saying is that you want to put a $20 plant in a $100 hole if you want to guarantee success. And the hole is usually where people take shortcuts because it's the hardest part of the whole process. If you look at my drawing there, there's some really critical information. You'll notice that the way they dug the hole is that the root crown is actually sitting 2 to 3 inches above the surrounding area. That's probably the most important thing to get right. Remember I said if planting too deep is a problem? Well, I'll show you why in a second, but it's really important that you don't over dig the hole. And a lot of people say, well, I over dig it and then I put soil back in. Well, remember your plants are going to get heavier and heavier and heavier as they mature. And oftentimes they will sink throughout their life, and they'll end up being deep even if they weren't installed too deep in the beginning. So just, if you're ever going to be lazy in your life, this is the time. Don't dig the hole too deep.
Hey, Tim.
Yeah.
Really quick, I just wanted to do a time check. We have about 20 minutes left, and we have about four-ish slides left, and we do want to leave time for questions. So I just want to do a little time check.
So dig the hole as wide as you dare. I mean, twice as wide as the root ball is a minimum, but you want the hole nice and wide, not too deep. You want the plant sitting up a little bit out of the hole. Now, what's not shown on that drawing is that you want to amend the backfill, mix organic material into the soil that you're going to put back in the hole around the plant. On natives, California natives, oftentimes they'll tell you not to. I've had pretty good success actually putting in. I don't know that you put in 20%, but maybe 10%. Organic material into the backfill. Tamp it lightly, but don't over tamp it. Don't compact that backfill too hard. You remember, you want that plant to start developing new roots almost immediately. So it's harder to do that in a compacted soil. And then the last thing is, if it's a tree and you're installing tree ties, you see you've got the 2 stakes there and the ties, you want those to go 90 degrees to the wind. So if where you're at on your property, you normally get wind that comes out of the west and goes to the east, then your tree stakes and your tree ties are going to go on the north side and the south side. And vice versa. If you're on your property, the wind normally comes out of the north and goes to the south, then you're going to want the tree stakes and the ties to be east and west. You want that tree to be able to move around. You don't want to have it tied so tight it can't move. You want it to be able to actually move around some. Next slide. Put a berm around your new plants, even if you're going to use drip irrigation. It's critical that you hand water in that new plant and really saturate the soil right after the plant goes in the ground. And a berm is the best way to hold that water so you don't get runoff. The other thing is the establishment period on most plants is usually about 2 summers. That you have to really care for them through the first summers. That berm is going to allow you to hand water those plants through those first couple of years. Even if you're using drip, you want to go out occasionally and give them an extra deep watering. Let's see. Okay, next slide. Oh, mulch. Hey, by the way, when you mulch your plant, put the mulch outside the berm. It doesn't do any good to put mulch inside the berm, because when you fill that basin up with water, the mulch basically just floats up, and then when it floats back down, it's gonna float down and around the main stem of the plant, the main trunk of the plant, and we don't want that. So just keep the mulch outside of the berm, because that's where the new developing roots are going to be anyway. It doesn't hurt a thing to keep the mulch outside the berm, and as a matter of fact, it can be harmful if you put it inside. The next slide. A little bit about mulch. The coarser, the better. You see in my slide there. That nice, coarse, chunky mulch is going to last much, much longer than that really beautiful black stuff that they have there, which means you're not going to have to apply it as often. That real fine material is going to break down quickly, and that's not what you want. You want something that's going to last for a while. Your plant will get a lot more benefit out of it. On the slide at the bottom where I say embrace the donut, if you look at the tree on the right, it says proper mulch. What you want your mulch to look like when you put it down around your plant is a donut. You want an actual hole where the plant sits. You want to keep the mulch away from the base of the plant by a minimum of 6 inches. One trend that we've been seeing is what they call the volcano, which is the picture on the left there, and that's where they're literally piling mulch up against the base of the tree, and they call that the volcano. And you do not want volcanoes. You want donuts. Next slide. This is why. You see the picture on the left there, you can see where the bark of the tree is all discolored. It was starting to rot out because of the mulch and the moisture that the mulch holds up against the bark. And if you see the picture on the right there where I say volcano damage, well, if you do that long enough, it will literally rot out the bottom of the tree and kill, not only kill the tree, but the tree will weaken and fall over. So you do not want mulch piled up against the base of your plants. You want at least 6 inches space between where your mulch stops and where your plant is. Next slide. And this is why. If you look at that drawing there that shows the tree and it shows the canopy drip line, you'll notice that there's 2 different kinds of roots on that tree. The roots that are going kind of up and down, and those are structural. That's what holds the tree up. And the roots that are going off to the sides, those are the feeder roots. And that's where the benefit of putting mulch is going to be, is on those feeder roots. It'll hold moisture in the soil and keep the soil cooler in the summertime. You look right at the trunk of the tree and there's basically nothing going on. There's really no benefit to putting mulch in that area. When you water, you want to water deeply and water infrequently. And the larger the plant, the more they benefit from drip. Like I said, I don't know that the drip would be a great choice for a vegetable garden with lots of annuals, but when you start getting into trees and shrubs, they thrive on drip because you can water deeply without runoff. And it encourages a better, bigger root zone, which makes that tree more drought tolerant. If you look at that picture on the bottom there, you'll see that they've actually gone around the root zone of that tree with the drip irrigation. Ideally, you want the drip irrigation to have 1 row out at the edge of the canopy, the drip line. And if you look at that picture, it shows you where that is. You want one row at the drip line, and then you want another row about halfway between the drip line and the trunk. Okay, next slide. All right, that's it. We're done. Questions?
I'm unmuting Ursula right now so that she can go through the chat box and answer any questions that we weren't able to get to.
Okay.
Thank you. Can everyone hear me? Priscilla, can you hear me?
Yes.
Okay, great. Well, thank you, everybody. So we have quite a few questions, Tim. Let me go to the first one from Susan. Will the commercial 10-10-10 nitrogen, phosphorus, potassium fertilizer, is that a good one to use?
Yeah, it's mild. Typically, you probably don't want to go above 15 or 16. So it's a little on the mild side, and there's nothing wrong with that, especially if you're going to be using organic materials also.
Okay. And what is a good source of phosphorus?
Let's see.
And we can go back to the slides. Let us know if you...
Bone meal. Bone meal. That's an organic source. Now, it takes a while to take effect. So you can buy, superphosphate and triple phosphate, which are commercial products. But if you want to go with an organic source of it, bone meal works great. But it takes about a year, so you won't see the real benefit of it until the following year.
So, and Tim, for myself, who's not an avid gardener, bone meal, what would be a good source for that, and how would you use it or prepare it?
You can buy it in the ground. Buy it in bags. It's called bone meal.
Okay.
It's a white powder. It is a byproduct of the rendering process. It's exactly what it sounds like. It's ground up bones.
Okay. And do most nurseries carry that?
Yes.
Okay, great. Let's see, some fertilizer says it's for acid-loving plants. Can you use it for other plants?
Oh, yeah, certainly. Typically, if it's for acid-loving plants, it has sulfur in it. And we have very alkaline soil, which is a low pH. No, excuse me, a high pH. And some plants like azaleas and camellias, they like soil with a low pH. So they don't do as well here unless you use a fertilizer that has some sulfur in it. And what happens is the sulfur in the fertilizer mixes with water and it creates a really mild sulfuric acid, and it drops the pH of the soil down.
Does it matter if it is regular fertilizer or buying organic fertilizer or organic nutrients for a vegetable garden or flowering plants?
Typically, the organic materials take longer to become available to the plant. They're a slow release. So if you're gardening in the same location year after year after year, if you use organic fertilizers, not a problem at all. If you're putting a garden in for the very first time or a flower bed for the very first time, you might want to go with a regular, chemical style fertilizer like I showed on the slide, just because they're going to be available to the plant much faster.
If my soil is clay and compacted, should I loosen the soil with added bags of soil and loosening soil with a garden tool?
Yes. Yeah, perfect.
Can you please describe the characteristics of nitrogen or iron deficiency in plants?
In nitrogen deficiency, basically the entire leaf starts turning yellow. We call it pallor, and the entire leaf just becomes kind of a yellow color. And iron deficiency is going to look like an X-ray where you've got green veins, but all of the flesh of the leaf around those green veins is going to be kind of yellow. So one of them, the entire nitrogen, the entire leaf turns yellow. Iron deficiency, the flesh in the leaf turns yellow, but the veins in the leaf remain green.
And then Pauline had asked, how do you know if you're overwatering a plant? And I know Christian had mentioned it can show the same signs as underwatering, but what are some of the signs if you're overwatering a plant?
Well, if the plant is sick, the root system's sick, you'll put water on it and it'll still look like it's dry. And what's happened there is that the root system has gotten sick and is not absorbing water the way it should. So if you're watering plants and they don't seem to be perking up like they used to, there's probably an issue with the root system. Some plants, and grass is a classic. It'll take all the water you can give it. I have never in my life seen a lawn overwatered in that it doesn't affect the grass. I mean, it can be sopping wet, muddy underneath, and the grass plant itself is fine. So you can't necessarily rely on looking at the plant to tell you that it's overwatering. What I would do is check the soil. If the soil is always damp and muddy in the root zone of the plant, cut back on how often you water.
Okay. And sometimes free mulch is offered. Well, in our city, there is free mulch offered, and it says, is it okay to use as you don't know what is in the mulch and if it has seeds in it? Or is it better to buy mulch? I know we get this question quite a lot. I have to say that, and I think Christian had answered this too, we did use mulch that was delivered to us at the Sheldon Reservoir, that large community demonstration garden at the corner of Coniston and Arroyo. We got mulch delivered from some local tree trimming companies and also from our own parks tree trimmings. And we were very happy with it. So I know it maybe is a hit and miss. What would you say, Tim, for someone that's looking to add some mulch to their garden?
Well, I'm cheap, so I like free mulch. So the stuff that you can get from free for the city, quite frankly, I've never seen any problems with it. And the one thing I really like about it is it's kind of a Heinz 57 of woods, because when they prune trees, they might do 2 sycamores and then an oak and then a pine and then a crepe myrtle and so you get a real blend of different kinds of woods, which is what you want. The stuff that you buy actually starts in the same places. The guys that are selling mulch in bulk, for the most part, oftentimes will get free mulch also. And then they'll mix it in with some of their higher end products like cedar or, things like that. So if it's a question of aesthetics, if you want 4 inches of mulch, I put down 3 inches of the cheap stuff and then I put 1 inch of the expensive, nice looking stuff over the top, the shredded cedar bark. If it's a question of performance, I've never seen a problem with the free mulch. It performs as well or better than anything that they purchase.
Great. We have a question here. What is the best variety of lavender for our clay and loam soils?
I've grown, not in Pasadena, but actually up in the Santa Clarita Valley, where they have much more clay in the soil. And I didn't find that the variety of lavender really made a difference. What I found was managing the water was what was critical. And the lavenders, I put them on drip irrigation and they just thrived. They did very well. Now, lavender tends to be, short-lived, especially in clay soil. So if you're getting 2 or 3 years out of your lavender, you're doing really well. Typically, when I put lavender in a landscape, I will recommend that it be replaced every 3 years or so. It has a tendency to root rot in clay soil.
I have a question here about, and I haven't heard this, it's a little, if you could tell us a little bit about solarizing soil to get rid of weeds.
Yeah, solarizing, it's a little bit different than the sheet mulching in that you're using plastic, typically black plastic, and you're trying to drive the soil temperature up. I haven't seen a lot of success with it, more so than just doing the sheet mulching, because typically you can't get the soil hot enough. I mean, it gets hot, don't get me wrong, but weeds have an amazing ability to tolerate heat and dryness. So what do you do with all that plastic when you're done? That's one of the big problems that I've had with the solarization. Now, if you're doing the sheet mulching, you're still getting heat into the soil, but it's the heat of composting. It's a biological heat as opposed to a sunlight heat. And really the most important thing is keeping the sunlight off the soil so that the seeds won't germinate. And if they do germinate, they can't get to the sunlight and photosynthesize. So they basically, the plant, dies of starvation.
And we have seen the great benefits of sheet mulching at our community demonstration garden site. Just that it really enhances also microbe activity, and you get a lot of good insects, and it just seems like it's a great way to amend the soil. So it has a lot of benefits to do it with more of a natural method using cardboard. We have a question here: is after mulch decomposes, is it beneficial or recommended to till over it to mix with native soil?
Mixing it in is great, but you don't have to. It's a lot of work. The one thing you have to be concerned with is damaging the roots of existing plants. So typically we don't do it. Now, if you're creating a brand new planting area and you're going to put down the mulch real heavy and let it stay on there for a while before you plant, and then right before you plant, you go in and till it in, fantastic. That would be a great practice. But as far as an existing landscape goes, just put it on the top of the soil, and Mother Nature will take care of the rest. It will decompose and go into that soil. And you'll see benefits down 8-12 inches.
And I think you might have addressed this already, but this question comes with, how can you tell which nutrients are lacking in soil? I had a year of tomatoes with blossom end rot.
Can you repeat the question?
Sure. It says, how can you tell which nutrients are lacking in soil? I had a year of tomatoes with blossom end rot. So
iron deficiency, nitrogen deficiencies, pretty easy. Phosphorus, typically your fruit and your flowers will fall off very easily. They don't stay on the plant.
If you have too much phosphorus?
No, not enough.
Not enough phosphorus.
You cannot have too much phosphorus. That's why a lot of what we do is kind of on a calendar when it comes to phosphorus. We add it, especially if we're using bone meal. We just go ahead and apply it every single year, just to make sure we don't have any lack of nutrient, lack of phosphorus in the soil, because nitrogen is really the element you have to be very careful of over applying. The rest of them are pretty liberal. You don't have to worry about damaging the plant so much.
Sorry, Tim, I also see that there was a person who actually responded to that question saying to check out a product called Luster Leaf Soil Tester, sold at Ace Hardware. It helped me get a good idea of what nutrients my soil was high or low in.
There you go. Yeah, the other way to go is test the soil yourself, or have your soil tested at a lab. There's a place down in Orange County called the Soil and Plant Lab, and they will do soil tests for you. There's also a place up in Peru that will test soil, and the name of that is just left my brain. But if you do do like a web search for soil labs in Southern California, you can have it done professionally done. And not only will they tell you everything you need to know about your soil, but oftentimes they will also make recommendations on what you should do as far as nutrients go.
Okay. Great, and I know we have quite a few more questions, so I'm gonna try to go through these as quickly as I can. One individual asked if you had to name one or several vegetables that require the least work and expense, what would they be? She is asking if there's anything foolproof or close to it in this area. For example, if she planted squash seeds from a squash that she bought from a farmer's market, would that work?
Oh, the chances of success are a lot less than if you just buy squash seed in a packet, you know, where they've been grown and processed particularly to go in. If I had to recommend a vegetable that was kind of bulletproof, I would go with the zucchinis and the squashes. Those tend to be pretty easy to grow. As far as, you know, buying one, eating it, saving the seeds and planting it, it's fun to do, and it's always very rewarding when it works, but a lot of times it doesn't work. Many seeds have to go through some kind of treatment in order to be viable.
We have a question here on what's your take on using tap water to water plants with regards to chlorine and chloramine?
Oh, yeah, not a problem. The soil basically takes care of those things. Quite frankly, plants need a very teeny tiny amount of chlorine. It's one of the essential elements that they require. But basically, your soil takes care of those. Once the chlorine contacts with the soil, it basically goes away.
Okay.
So I wouldn't worry about it. Just don't use soft water.
And they asked for clarification when you were discussing building a berm. Is this just for tree planting or any transplants?
I use it on everything.
Okay. And for the lawn, do you still water deep, water less for a lawn watering?
Absolutely.
Okay.
No runoff. If you start getting runoff, you have to stop your watering, wait a while, and then begin the watering again. So if you need to water for 20 minutes, you might water for 10, wait 30 minutes, and then water another 10.
Okay. And then what would be an easy vegetable to grow in the winter?
Oh, let me circle around back to that.
Okay. And then we have some questions about free mulch available in Pasadena, so I can answer that. We do have free mulch available for pickup, both at Victory Park and Robinson Park, and there's a schedule for that on both the Water and Power webpage and the Public Works webpage. If you do a search for mulch on either of our web pages, you will find that. And we can send a link to participants. I just saw that, Priscilla, thank you. So we'll send the link to everyone that's registered on the free mulch program. Can I add garden lime on soil, and what is the benefit, Tim?
Typically, we don't need lime. And generally, they lime soils that are high in pH, and we have just the opposite problem. So I would not recommend liming your soil. If anything, you might want to consider putting some soil sulfur down to lower the pH.
Now I know we're getting to the end here. We're already a few minutes over, so I'm going to jump to a few of the questions, and hopefully we have answered everyone. One of the questions is, does bone meal differ from rock phosphate?
It's organic. I mean, one's a mineral and the other's organic.
Okay. And there was a question if you can use loose layers of newspaper for mulching, and we combined. I know when we sheet mulched, we did use some newspaper and cardboard.
Put down plenty of sheets of it though, because it's so thin.
Yeah. And do you have any recommendations for controlling spider mites? Oh,
they are so hard. Cinnamon oil seems to be, typically spider mites are, they only worry about them in like a nursery setting, and they have very strong chemicals that they can use for them. Safer soaps and cinnamon oil are sort of the homeowner. They don't have any residual. They're contact only, so they have to be reapplied on a pretty regular basis.
I have one of our participants said habanero spray works. So I know habanero is like a chili spray for
Don't
spider
get it-
mites.
Don't get it in your eyes.
Yeah, wear protective glasses. Okay, I think this will be the last question. It's the blossoms on the plant are yellow-orange, but blossoms fall off before any signs of squash. What may be the problem?
Could be overwater.
Okay.
That's another, if it's not overwater, it might be you need phosphorus.
Okay, so I think that's it for the questions that I have. I'm going to turn it back over to you, Priscilla. Thank you.
Okay, thank you so much, everyone. We truly appreciate you being here. We will follow up. I will get the list of registrants to send over that link for the free mulch. We'll also send over the PowerPoint, and then we will have this recording up on our webpage, and we'll send over the link of where you can view the recording if you want to share that with anyone.
Can I jump in real quick?
Sure.
There was a question on winter vegetables. Kale is really popular now. Broccoli is another good one. Cabbage, cauliflower, those are all pretty good winter vegetables for here, for this area.
Thank you.
Wait, Priscilla, we do have a question that says if we have any workshops like this in Spanish. So we have done workshops in the past in Spanish. If you're interested, please email us and we can see what we can work out to coordinate something like this in Spanish.
All right. Thank you, everyone, so much. Have a wonderful weekend.
Thank you so much, Tim. That was a wonderful presentation.
Okie doke. Stay cool.
Thank you, everybody. Bye-bye.